Jesus' skin was black. Before you doubt that, calm down first. Watch this video to the end, and I promise you, you will be surprised by what you are about to discover. Now, I know what just happened in your head. Some of you tensed up. Some of you almost clicked away. And some of you are curious, maybe even a little uncomfortable. And that is exactly why you need to stay. Because this is not about politics. This is not about race wars or trying to make you angry. This is about what the historical record actually says, what the Bible actually describes, and what has quietly been sitting in plain sight for centuries while most of us were handed a very different picture. So breathe and stay with me. Before we get to Jesus, we need to spend just a moment, and I mean just a moment, in the bloodline he came from. Because you cannot fully understand who he was without understanding where he came from. His family tree is not a small thing. It tells us everything. Jacob had 12 sons. These 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Jacob himself was not a pale man. The people of that ancient region, what we now call the Middle East, connecting into North Africa, were not light-skinned people. The Bible does not describe them that way. History does not describe them that way. And the DNA evidence that archaeologists and geneticists have worked through in recent decades does not describe them that way either. These were deeply bronzed people. Dark, earthy sun kissed from generations of living under intense heat in a desert region that connected directly into African soil. Among Jacob's sons, Judah was special, not because he was the most obedient, he wasn't, but because it was through Judah's line that the most significant figure in all of human history would eventually come. The Bible is clear on that. Judah's tribe carried the royal line, and Judah himself, his parents, his community, dark-skinned people. This is not a controversial claim among serious historians. It is just history. Now, let's go straight to Jesus. Jesus was born into that same line, the line of Judah. His parents were Jewish, from that same ancient bloodline that traced back through Judah, through Jacob, through a lineage of people who were, by every available historical marker, dark-skinned. But it doesn't stop at ancestry. The story of Jesus' actual life, from birth to adulthood, makes the picture even clearer. And it starts in Africa. When Jesus was still a baby, barely old enough to be called a toddler, his family ran. They fled in the middle of the night because a king named Herod wanted him dead. Herod had heard that a new king had been born, and Herod was not the kind of man who shared power. So he sent soldiers. And Joseph, Jesus' father, had a dream telling him to take the child and his mother and go to Egypt. Right now. Don't wait for morning. Just go. So they went to Egypt. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that means. Egypt was not a random choice on a map. Egypt was Africa. The people of Egypt at that time were not white Europeans. They were African people. Dark-skinned, melanin-rich, African people. This is not my opinion. This is what every serious Egyptologist, every credible historian, every bone analysis and ancient painting from that region confirms. The Egypt of that era, the Egypt that Jesus' family ran into for safety, was a black African civilization. Now here is the thing that hits different when you actually sit with it. Joseph was told to hide in Egypt, to blend in, to disappear into the population until it was safe to come back. That was the whole point of going to Egypt. If the soldiers of Herod came looking, the family needed to be invisible. They needed to look like everybody else. They needed to not stand out. Think about what that means. If Jesus and his family were pale, blue-eyed, light-haired people, they could not have hidden in Egypt. They would have stood out immediately. A family of light-skinned people trying to blend into a dark African population would have been spotted in 5 minutes. Herod's men would have found them in a day. They would have been obvious, conspicuous. There would have been nowhere to hide. But they did hide. The Bible says they stayed in Egypt for a while, living among the Egyptian people, until it was safe to return. That hiding worked, which means they blended in, which means they looked like the people around them, which means Jesus, as a child growing up in Africa, looked African. Let that sit. Now some people will say, okay, But that doesn't prove anything definitive about what he looked like. Fair enough. Let's go further. Let's go to the Bible itself. The book of Revelation is the last book in the Bible. It is full of visions and descriptions. And in chapter 1, the Apostle John describes a vision of the risen Jesus. Now, this is the part that most churches skip over, or read very quickly, or translate in a way that softens what is actually being said. Because what John describes is not the pale, sandy-haired figure that has been painted over and over for centuries in European art. John says that Jesus' head and hair were white as wool, white as snow. His eyes were like flames of fire, and his feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. Burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. Do you know what burnished bronze looks like? Go look it up right now if you don't. Bronze is already a rich, deep, dark, reddish-brown color. When you take bronze and you put it in a furnace and you heat it until it burns and refines, it gets darker, it gets deeper. It becomes this intense, almost black-brown color, gleaming and dark like polished wood under sunlight. That is what John described when he saw the feet of Jesus in this vision. The Bible said it. John saw it, and he wrote it down exactly as he saw it. Now I need to ask you something honestly. If you wanted to describe a white man's feet, would you compare them to burnished bronze fired in a furnace? No, you wouldn't. That is not the comparison that comes to your mind when you look at pale skin. Bronze in a furnace is the comparison you reach for when you are looking at something deeply, richly, unmistakably dark-toned. And the hair like wool. Again, whose hair grows like wool? Wool is thick, coiled, tightly textured. You know exactly what kind of hair that description is reaching for. It is not straight, fine, flowing European hair. Wool is a very specific texture. It is the texture of African hair. Tightly coiled, densely packed, naturally textured hair. That is wool. And the Bible said that is what Jesus' hair was like. Now I know someone is going to say, the white as snow part means his hair was white, not describing the texture as dark. And yes, the white is about color, the whiteness of age or divine glory. But the texture comparison, wool, that is still there. John could have said his hair was white as snow and left it at that. But he didn't. He specifically said white as wool. He chose wool. Not silk, not linen, not feathers. Wool, because the texture he was describing could only be compared to wool. The texture of that hair was a coiled natural texture. The color may have been luminous white in the vision, but the texture was wool. These are John's words. These are the Bible's words. Nobody invented this. Nobody added it in later. It has been sitting in Revelation chapter 1 for centuries. Let's go even deeper. There is a long and complex history of art involving Jesus. And almost universally, especially in Western, European-influenced Christianity, that art shows Jesus as a pale, light-skinned man with straight or wavy light hair. Where did that image come from? Because it certainly did not come from the Bible. It did not come from the historical record. It did not come from any eyewitness account. What is documented is that the image of Jesus as a white European man was largely shaped during the Byzantine era and then amplified through the Renaissance. European painters painted Jesus to look like Europeans because that is what they knew, that is what their patrons wanted, and frankly, that is what held political and cultural power in their world. The image served a purpose. It made Jesus feel familiar, relatable, and authoritative within a European context. That is understandable as art history, but it has nothing to do with who Jesus actually was. The earliest known images of Jesus, some of the oldest Christian art ever found, tell a very different story. Early Christian art found in North Africa, in Coptic Egypt, in the ancient Ethiopian church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, depicts Jesus as a dark-skinned man. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has existed for nearly 2,000 years, has always depicted Jesus as a man who looks like them, not because of politics, not because of modern racial debates, but because their tradition predates all the European repainting, because their tradition is old enough to have carried a more accurate memory. the Coptic Christians of Egypt, the same Egypt where Jesus spent his early childhood. They also historically depicted Jesus as dark-skinned. These are the people who lived where he lived as a child. These are the people whose ancestors would have seen him as a baby walking through their streets. And they painted him dark. But let's not just rely on art. Let's talk about geography and biology for a moment, because this is where it gets undeniable. Jesus grew up in Galilee, in ancient Palestine, in the modern-day Middle East, not in Scandinavia, not in Northern Europe. He grew up in a region with an intense, unforgiving sun. He was an outdoor person, walking everywhere, working with his hands, spending extended periods in the wilderness, walking across deserts, traveling on foot under open skies. Nobody who lives that kind of life, under that kind of sun, in that geographic region, is pale. That is not how human biology works. That is not how melanin works. People whose ancestors lived for generations in that region had dark skin because dark skin is what survives and thrives under that level of UV radiation. This is not speculation. This is basic human biology. The people of ancient Israel were not white. They were not light-skinned in the way European art has portrayed them. They were a people of the ancient Near East, deeply connected ethnically and geographically to North Africa, living in a sun-hammered landscape that required melanin for survival. Jesus was one of these people. He looked like these people. He would have been indistinguishable from a dark-skinned man of that region. And here is something else that the Bible says that people often overlook. When Judas betrayed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he had to point Jesus out to the soldiers. He had to identify him with a kiss. Why? Think about that question seriously. Why did Judas have to physically single out Jesus from the group? If Jesus had pale skin, light hair, blue eyes, if he looked dramatically different from everyone around him, you wouldn't need a secret signal to identify him. He would have been immediately obvious. You would just walk up to the pale guy standing in the middle of a group of dark-skinned people. But Judas needed to identify him, which means Jesus looked like everyone else in that garden. He blended in. He was indistinguishable from his disciples in the darkness, unless you pointed him out. That detail, that tiny, easy-to-miss detail in the betrayal story, quietly tells you everything about what Jesus looked like. He looked like the people around him. He looked like the people of that region. He was not obviously different. He was one of them. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. There is an ancient text, not the Bible, but a historical document that describes Jesus physically. It is a letter that circulated in early Christian history, claimed to be written by a man named Publius Lentulus, who was supposedly a Roman official describing Jesus to the Roman Senate. Now, historians debate whether this letter is genuine or a later forgery, so I want to be honest with you about that. But what is interesting is even this document, written in a European political context, by people who had nothing to gain from describing a dark man, even this describes Jesus as having dark skin. It describes his complexion as olive or brown-toned. Even the documents that come out of Roman administrative history lean toward describing a darker complexioned man. But we don't need to rely on contested documents. We have the Bible, we have history, we have geography, we have biology, and we have John's vision in Revelation, which is as close to a direct physical description of Jesus as the Bible gives us. And it describes feet like burnished bronze in a furnace and hair like wool. Now here is something I want to address directly, because I know it is in the back of some of your minds. Some people will say, does it matter? Why does this matter? Why are we even talking about this? And that is a fair question. So let me be honest with you about why it matters. It matters because truth matters. Full stop. Whatever you believe about Jesus spiritually, the historical truth about who he was and what he looked like should be told accurately. Any person deserves to have their actual identity acknowledged, not replaced by a fabricated image that suits someone else's cultural agenda. It also matters because the image shapes the message. For centuries, the image of a white European Jesus was used sometimes deliberately, sometimes through cultural laziness, in contexts that harmed real people. It was used in colonized countries to imply that Christianity was a European religion for European people. It was used in ways that disconnected entire populations from a faith that actually originated in their part of the world. It was used to make the faith feel foreign to the very people who lived in the region where Jesus actually walked. The actual historical Jesus was not European. He was a man from the ancient Near East, from a Jewish community rooted in a lineage connected to Africa, who spent a portion of his childhood on African soil, and who the Bible itself describes with physical features that are unmistakably consistent with a dark-skinned man. That is not a radical claim. That is not an attack on anyone's faith. That is just history. That is just what the Bible says. That is just what the geography confirms. That is just what the biology supports. And yet somehow, saying it out loud still surprises people. Because the image we have been given is so powerful, so repeated, so deeply embedded in art and media and church paintings and movie portrayals that the truth feels shocking when you encounter it. That is not because the truth is wrong. That is because the replacement image was very, very thoroughly installed. Let's go back to the physical description one more time, because I want to make sure this lands. Revelation 1:14-15. The Bible says, "His head and his hair were white as wool, white as snow. His eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace." Bronze glowing in a furnace. Close your eyes and imagine that. Not bronze sitting on a shelf. Not bronze at room temperature. Bronze in a furnace. Bronze being heated. The kind of deep, rich, intense, glowing darkness that comes from superheated metal. That is the comparison John reached for. And John was describing the body of Jesus. Now I want you to think about one more thing. The people who first spread Christianity, the earliest Christian communities outside of Israel, were not in Europe. They were in Africa and the Middle East. Ethiopia had a Christian community within decades of the crucifixion. Egypt had one of the most powerful early Christian communities in the world. North Africa produced some of the most significant early Christian thinkers in history. The faith spread through Africa and the Middle East first, before it ever became a European religion. And in those early African Christian communities, nobody was surprised by the idea of a dark-skinned Jesus. It was not a controversy. It was not a debate. He looked like them, because he was from the same part of the world as them, and his family had literally lived among their ancestors in Egypt. The debate only started much later. When the faith moved into European culture, and European artists started painting Jesus to look like the people they knew. Think about the census in ancient Egypt. Every ancient Egyptian census ever conducted, every administrative record from that period, classified the population as African, not as Semitic foreigners, not as a mixed Middle Eastern group. The Egyptians of the ancient world, the ones who surrounded baby Jesus and his family when they fled there, were African people, and when that family arrived, they blended in. They survived. They raised Jesus for years in that environment. In Africa, among African people, under an African sun, and when they went back to Galilee, they went back as people who had spent formative years on African soil. Now here is something that I personally find remarkable, and I want to be real with you about why. So many people around the world, especially people of African descent, have been told that their history, their ancestors, their roots have nothing to do with the biblical story. They have been taught the faith as something that came to them from outside, from Europe, brought by missionaries who often came alongside colonizers. That narrative has caused deep pain, deep disconnection, and a lot of people have walked away from faith entirely because of it. But the historical record says something completely different. The historical record says that the lineage at the heart of the Bible ran through a region directly connected to Africa. It says that Jesus himself grew up in Africa. It says the earliest Christians were African. It says the faith's roots are not European at all. They are ancient. They are connected to the same African soil that houses some of the oldest human civilizations in history. That is not a small thing. That is history being corrected. That is the record being set straight. And the Bible said it first. The book of Daniel, chapter 10, describes a vision of a heavenly figure, and while this is not universally interpreted as a description of Jesus, many scholars connect it to the same kind of visionary language used in Revelation. The figure in Daniel's vision is described with a body like beryl, a face like lightning, eyes like torches of fire, arms and legs gleaming like polished bronze. Again, bronze. Again, fire. Again, deep, rich, intense darkness. These are the images the Bible consistently reaches for when describing divine figures in the Hebrew and early Christian tradition. Not pale, not light, bronze, fire, burnished, deep. This language is not accidental. The people writing these texts knew what they were describing. They were describing what they saw in their visions and what they knew from their world. And the comparisons they chose, wool, bronze, furnace, those are the comparisons of people describing dark-skinned bodies. Because that is the world they lived in. That is what divinity looked like to them, and the imagery their culture understood. Now let's circle back to the Egypt detail, one final time, because I want you to really feel the weight of it. Mary and Joseph took Jesus, and they ran. Middle of the night. Grab the baby and go. They ran all the way to Egypt. They hid there. The Bible says Herod was furious when he realized the wise men had not come back to tell him where the child was. He ordered the killing of all male children 2 years old and under in the Bethlehem region. That is how desperate the situation was. That is how serious the danger was. And the hiding place that God chose, because in the story it was a divine instruction, Joseph received this in a dream. The hiding place was Egypt. Africa, not Greece, not Rome, not some distant land with a different kind of people. Africa, the continent that shares a land border with the ancient Israeli region. The continent whose people looked like the people of that region. The continent where a family from ancient Judah could disappear into the population without standing out. The geography of the Bible is not accidental. The places the story moves through were chosen for specific reasons, and when you pay attention to those reasons, the picture of who these people were becomes very clear. Jesus grew up partially in Africa. He was born into a dark-skinned ancient Jewish family. He lived his adult life in a sun-baked desert region that has never been hospitable to pale skin. He was described in the Bible's own vision of him as having feet like burnt bronze and hair like wool. And he died in the same region where his people had lived for generations, looking like those people, blending in with those people, until one of his own closest companions had to physically point him out to strangers in the dark. None of this is invented. All of it is there. In the history, in the geography, in the biology, and in the Bible itself. The image of Jesus that most of the world has been given is a European painting. It is beautiful art. But it is not history. It is not what the Bible describes. And it is not what any credible historical or scientific analysis of the period supports. The real Jesus was a dark-skinned man. He was from a dark-skinned lineage. He grew up on African soil. He was described with features that make sense on a dark-skinned body and make no sense on the body of a pale European man. And this has been true this entire time, sitting in plain sight, written in the same Bible that billions of people read, in the same historical records that scholars have had access to for centuries. And here is what I want you to take away from all of this. This is not about making Jesus belong to one group of people at the expense of another. That would be missing the entire point. Jesus, if you believe the biblical account of who he was, came for everyone. His message was not for one ethnic group. His life was not a story about one nation. The whole point of the story is that it reached beyond every boundary. But reaching beyond every boundary does not mean erasing the actual, historical, physical truth of who he was. A person can belong to everyone without being stripped of their actual identity. A person can be universal in their message while still being specific in their history. And the specific history says this: Jesus was a dark-skinned man from the ancient Near East. His family line was dark. His childhood was in Africa. His feet, in John's vision, were like bronze in a furnace. His hair was like wool. The Bible said it. The history confirms it. The geography supports it. And now you know it. So the next time you see a painting or a movie or a church mural with a pale, blue-eyed Jesus, I am not asking you to be angry. I am not asking you to tear anything down. I am just asking you to remember what the actual record says. Remember what John saw in his vision. Remember the family that blended into Egypt. Remember the betrayal that required a physical signal because he looked like everyone around him. Remember the feet like burnished bronze. Remember the hair like wool. Remember the real story, because it has been there this whole time.